Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming here. Europe, ladies and gentlemen, Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. This, ladies and gentlemen, were the first historic words that the French Foreign Affairs Minister Robert Schuman began his declaration with on the 9th of May 1950, which is considered to be a first step towards the creation of what is now the European Union. And it is with these eloquent words that I would like to welcome, as Mayor of the city of Maastricht, you to the 17th Schuman Lecture, an annual event organized by the Maastricht University and the city of Maastricht. Our guest speaker today is one of the most influential women, yes, in Europe, Dr. Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga. And that is only the first applause you get tonight. In her lecture entitled The Long-Term Future of the EU, she deals with the possible future course of the European Union based on both best case and worst case scenarios. Taking a positive approach, she highlights the successes achieved by the EU, examples of which include the consistently robust economy and the reunification with the former Eastern Bloc countries. On the other hand, she demonstrates that the EU is suffering from an increasing administrative burden and that it remains difficult to develop common policy. However, I'm optimistically assuming that Dr. Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga will conclude by sketching a positive future for Europe. Or am I wrong? No, it will be a positive future, even with the policies of Greece today and of some other countries who think different about the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the university and the city are both very proud to welcome this very influential woman to the birthplace of the European Union here in Maastricht. Between 1999 and 2007, she was President of Latvia. She's one of the founders of the Club of Madrid, a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and she was the only female candidate for the first presidency of the European Council. And she is a member of the Global Leadership Foundation. In all those positions, she is a great advocate for Europe. And, as far as she is concerned, even a federal Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Dr. Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, Your Worship, the Mayor of Maastricht, Rector Magnificus, professors, students, ladies and gentlemen. I've traveled today, most of the day, from the eastern borders of the European Union to what are at least the continental western borders of the Union. And I think it was a worthwhile exercise in my eyes because it allowed me to sense the breadth and the scope of what has become of that initial sneaky idea of Robert Schuman and his friend Monnet when 51 years ago they managed to pass through their government a seemingly innocuous innovation, but that was the oak that grew from that small acorn is the union that we see today. And I was happy to come to Maastricht particularly because, of course, the coal and steel union that Monnet and Schuman conceived those many decades ago became the European Union here in Maastricht, at least officially. And I think that this is something that the city can forever be proud of, because it has entered history in a positive way, when so much of our European history, as at least I had to learn in school, and I'm sure you did as well, was nothing but a series of bloody battles, of inequities, of oppression. And of course, for quite a few centuries, Europe was also a center of colonialism. It was a major consumer of slaves from Africa and other places. And even as it colonized far-off lands in far-off continents and brought in many ways what were terrific cultural achievements, it was not, by a long shot, an example, a shining example to the world, except thanks to those occasional individuals in European society who once in a while would come up with a very bright idea. I'm thinking of Wilberforce in Great Britain and his idea about abolishing slavery. All his best friends thought he was completely nuts, that he was ruining his life and that of his family. When you had Henri Dunant from Switzerland seeing the slaughter that happened on the battlefield, where soldiers on both sides were dying more from the wounds received in battle than from direct deaths resulting from armed intervention. And when he decided to invert the Swiss flag and create the Red Cross for international aid, those were the innovators from many countries and through many centuries who, in my opinion and in my view, put together, brick by brick and step by step, the system of values on which eventually the European Union that we know today could be built. And it's a very strange phenomenon to see that in polls across the 27 members, the understanding of the achievements of the Union frequently lags behind the objective measures of achievement that the European Union can be proud of. If you look at nothing else but the economic weight that Europe carries in the world, 11% of the total world's population, accounting for nearly a quarter of its economic production. Europe is punching above its weight in terms of economic efficiency. It is punching above its weight in terms of aid to developing countries. It is #1 in the world as far as aid is concerned. And Europe is a beacon of hope in terms of social justice, of social equality, certainly competing with what the United States was in the 19th century, when after the French donated the Statue of Liberty to the city of New York, the United States became the place to which people went to build up new life, and the American dream became a reality for many of them. Ever since the bipolar world of the Cold War came to an end, and thank the heavens for that, the United States has lost the position as hegemon in the world that it had been carrying for so long, and where it had positioned itself as a defender of the free world because of its military might. But I would say that ever since the end of the Second World War, the United States, as a beacon of freedom, of justice, of equality, had a competitor in Europe. And having lived on the North American continent in Canada for much of my life, I have been able to watch both Europe and the United States from outside, but also from inside, and compare the two. And it has struck me that as far as social justice is concerned, Americans are absolutely and totally concerned that they have the best country in the world, bar none. Europeans, if you scratch them, you will recognize that their system of a social market economy rather than a free-for-all, if you like, of the American Wild West, or even of the mid-20th century in North America, that the social safety nets that Europe provides to its citizens are broader, are more comprehensive, in many ways are fairer than those that you get in North America. But that famous behaviorist, B.F. Skinner, has pointed out in one of his last lectures to the American Psychological Association that social service networks, while they are fair and equitable and are an expression of a humane solidarity with the less fortunate in any society, are in many ways counterintuitive and counterproductive in terms of getting the most out of a society. If, as in some countries in Europe now, you get as much for being on a dole as for taking simple jobs and simple tasks that need to be done in a country and that need to be done in society, you are in fact providing a disincentive for full participation in a workforce. And I think that here we come full circle, starting out with the idea that wealth as it is generated should be shared among those who are not able to participate in wealth creation with as much efficiency as others. This is one of the fundamental principles of justice, certainly in all democracies. The level to which Europe has gone in raising the safety net has, and the recent economic crisis has shown it, has come to the point where we are wondering what is the trade-off between incentives that incite people and encourage them to participate actively in the workforce and to continue in collective wealth creation, or to simply sit back on the dole and say, well, as a citizen, I have a right to be supported and let others work for me. So philosophically, I think, and of course in Europe, this has been the issue between the right and the left in terms of political parties and political orientations. Lately, I think the economic crisis of 2008 and the following, or rather the financial crisis followed by the economic crisis, has made us rethink a great many postulates and assumptions that we had about the free market economy, but following from that, about the degree of government control, or lack of it, and about the best method of governance. Just coming over on the plane, I had occasion to read a statement by one of our local Latvian mini-oligarchs who said that Vike-Freiberga should be pursued in justice for the harm she's done to her country by making it enter into the European Union. Well, I think it was too much of a compliment to me because, of course, I didn't do it single-handedly. In fact, we had a referendum on it, as did so many other countries. But, of course, I did, as then President, argue quite openly in favor of such a move, even though our Constitution, of course, did not say anything about the rights of the President to do so or not. That's precisely why we had to have a referendum. Our Constitution, the first article says, the power belongs to the Latvian people. If you are going to delegate some of your power to somebody else, in this case the European Union, there had to be a referendum on it, and there had to be arguments why you are delegating it. I think if you look at polls and questionnaires across Europe today, the question most inhabitants of the European Union today have is this: am I getting out of it, I myself personally, out of this whole situation? Am I getting more out of it for my country being in the European Union rather than being out of it? Because those are the two choices. You do have countries like Switzerland and Norway and Iceland who for a long time can go it alone and quite happily so. But then you see what happens to Iceland when a crisis hits. They do need to turn to somebody else for help. So I would say that the choices that we make here are very much like those that you as individuals will be making all along every step in your life. You will be making a decision, trying to decide, is that the right path for me? What do I get out of it? But what do I put into it in return? Maybe a few brief words about the kind of argumentation I saw from my country, why it needed to join the Union. But before I do that, let me for a few moments step back into history, into that moment when Schuman, with the end of Monet, came up with his declaration. What kind of Europe was it? That was the Europe of my childhood, when, fleeing from communist occupation in my country, my parents traversed the whole north of the northern European plain and stopped at the refugee camp near Lübeck, just on the border with what was to become East Germany. I saw a Germany in absolute total ruin and wreck, divided between 4 occupying powers. And these occupying powers, among them France and Great Britain, not being all that terribly better off themselves. Britain had coupons for food for a very long time after the war. France had economic difficulties. I think the Benelux countries were not enjoying in the post-war years either the best years in their history. But there was peace in Europe, and there was stability. And there was freedom from tyranny for all that part of Europe that had been freed from fascism, the thing that is today being celebrated in Russia and by the Russian-speaking populations of the former many Soviet republics. One tyranny had fallen, and people had the chance to rebuild their lives, and they had the chance to build democracies where before there had been ideologies, either of the extreme right or the extreme left, as the only choices. Half of Europe had no choice. My country was under military occupation. Others were also, you saw Hungary revolting in 56, Czechoslovakia revolting in 68. The repressions that came were military and with tanks. These people did not have a choice about their systems. Much of the west of Europe, by the way, didn't have that much choice either. Portugal had Salazar, Spain had Franco, Greece had civil war. Europe, at that time, Tito, of course, in Yugoslavia. Europe was not exactly the shining beacon of democracy to the world, that it actually managed to become, step by step, step by painful step, over the years and over the decades. And even as that process of democratization and increase in human rights was going on, what Europe experienced was a growth in prosperity. And I think the two going hand in hand was such a happy coincidence that people everywhere became convinced that freedom and democracy was the best recipe for peace, security, and a chance to build a better life than your parents or your grandparents had. And this became realized for millions and tens of millions, and indeed several hundred million in Western Europe as the decades went on. Whereas the totalitarian ideology of the communist system in the eastern part of Europe increasingly led to a pauperization of the people, even as they had the first man in space, and even as they had great accomplishments in science and many other fields. The day-to-day life of people in the communist countries kept getting worse and worse instead of better. I remember visiting some of my relatives when in the 70s and 80s, increasingly the restrictions on former exiles were lifted, and one could obtain visas and visit there, always, of course, being followed by KGB person and your phones being listened to in the hotel rooms, and every visitor who came being checked in and clocked in and later interrogated by the secret police. But under those conditions, I remember some of my relatives saying, "Tell me, what is it like in Western Europe? Because we do get news, for instance, about the poor oppressed workers in England going on strike. And we were watching on television these people out with their placards and striking. And I said, I never saw such terrific jeans and such terrific jackets. And do you think you could maybe send me something in the parcel that resembles those poor oppressed workers of Britain? Because they were having these terrific clothes, because those were the days when in Latvia the shoe factories had a program of producing so many pairs of shoes a year. So if one year they produce brown shoes, and another year they produce black ones, or again grey ones, and that's the ones you had. And you were lucky that they didn't decide to produce children's shoes, because it's the same number of pairs, and you can fulfill your program and so on. But the grown-ups have a bit of difficulty finding shoes. When the Berlin Wall came down on November 9th, 1989, and Germany became united, that Germany that was split apart because the occupying powers were scared of what a united Germany would do, I think was a big step in the unification of Europe, but it wasn't the last one. Because you still had the satellite countries under communist yoke. And one by one, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, slowly started getting rid of their communist totalitarian governments. But the Baltic states didn't get out from under until the failure of the August 1991 putsch. But we were ready for it. We had the Declaration of Independence and we were ready to go. So when the opportunity came now for Western Europe, that had enjoyed peace and prosperity and democracy for half a century, and there was this other half that had been held under a totalitarian rule for all this time, and in our case a foreign occupying rule, and now the doors were open, the wall came down, the Iron Curtain disappeared. What was the reaction of Western Europe? Two very human reactions. Some people were scared out of their wits as to what was going to happen to their welfare. And I think some people are scared out of their wits even today as to what is going to happen to me, to my pension, to my job, to my future. First it was the Polish plumber, and then it was anybody else from Eastern Europe who might be taking away your job. But we see now on the island of Lampedusa 1,000 refugees arriving a day. And why are they coming to Europe? Why are they not going to Morocco or to Saudi Arabia or to Yemen or any other place? Why is it that Europe keeps attracting these people? And why is it that Europe, in fact, Western Europe, which was so scared of Eastern Europe, only has about 2 million of them scattered all around, including here, as against 19 million from all other parts of the world? So, against these figures, I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, thank heavens for those far-sighted politicians and the populations who did tolerate them and re-elect them and accept them, who saw that Europe could not continue on its path of welfare, of happiness, of peace and security, and keep ignoring the other half of the continent. That other part had to be recuperated. It had to be brought closer to Europe. What I tried to explain to the Latvian people when they said, we have just come out of, 50 years of foreign oppression and rule in a Soviet Union as one of the 15 so-called republics. Are we now to join another union? And instead of the orders coming from Brussels, they're now coming from Moscow, they're coming from Brussels now. What is going to be the difference? Well, all the difference in the world. all the difference in the world, and in our case, as a matter of fact, ensuring that the directives came out of Brussels, as far as I was personally concerned, was one way of making sure that they never again came from Moscow. Which is, by the way, another of the activities during my presidency, was that we saw as a priority the need to join NATO. Precisely because getting orders from somewhere else and having no choice in the matter is one thing. But participating in something where you are a full-blown member and where big and small and medium sit at the same table, where the Irish with great satisfaction sit down next to their former British oppressors, where tiny little Luxembourg sits next to huge Germany and France. This is no small accomplishment, even if, as many will of course point out, the real decisions that count, and many of the important decisions, do take place between the largest players. I mean, it is a fact of life, and we cannot deny that. But this is not the same as having a totalitarian system or a monarchy with full powers such as Europe had so many of in past centuries. I think the beauty of the European Union is that every country, large and small, can sit at the table. Now, I'll grant you that this is possibly a metaphor rather than the reality. For instance, the Lisbon Treaty, which gave us the instruments now to try and govern this 27-head body instead of the 6 and the 12 and the 15 that it used to be before, has given more power to the European Parliament with the idea that a country like Germany, with all its millions of people, should have a chance for each of its citizens to be represented at some level, at a higher level, say, than Latvia or Luxembourg, or Lithuania for that matter. And this is only fair. But then when you look at the number of deputies that a small country sends to the European Parliament, you may be forgiven for thinking, as many Latvians do, that there's precious little that our half dozen or so deputies can do to change the direction of that ship. The curious thing is that from what brief 7-year experience we have had, even a small number of deputies in the European Parliament has a chance to be heard. They participate in committees. They seek out political parties with which they have certain sympathies, and they can be heard rather than remaining outside of the door. This makes a huge difference. As far as the European Council goes, of course, it's really up to each individual country how activities in dialogue, in seeking partners, in seeking allies. A small country can punch above its weight, just like Europe is punching above its weight in the world, if it is persuasive enough, if it has sound arguments, if it has the power of conviction. This said, the achievements of Europe until now, I thought, were worthy of emulation. And for those countries that had been under totalitarian rule like mine, the acquis communautaire, everything that Europe had built up, painfully, step by step, brick by brick, law by law and regulation by foolish regulation sometimes. All this was work that had been accomplished, and we did not need to reinvent the wheel. We could jump on the wagon and go on driving with it, even as, of course, like anybody else, we would find plenty to criticize. And I am among those who, as on closer contact with structures of the European Union, such as, for instance, the Commission, and seeing the heaviness of its bureaucracy, the rigidity of its procedures, I have often felt that here is a machine that is at risk of breaking down from its own weight. It needs to lighten up. It needs to do something to oil the mechanisms better and to simplify the procedures. But this is work in progress, this can be done. When you build up from 6 to 12 to 15 to 27 and possibly more in the future, it does become a rather unwieldy beast to control. And the question then is how much you want to really have in centralized hands and how much do you leave according to the principle, the holy principle of subsidiarity of the European Union, to the lower levels. And Mr. Mayor, I am not a federalist yet because I don't think Europe is ready for being a federated state, for the simple reason that its many countries, its many members, have too varied baggage, you might say, of past history, of past wrongs suffered and wrongs committed, its cultural heritage, the language richness and diversity that they would be loath to abandon. And I think this is one of the reasons when people feel threatened in who they are, in their identity, in their uniqueness as members of some cultural, linguistic or ethnic group, they become reluctant to engage in those programs of vast solidarity that are needed for Europe to act on the international scene. And the way I see the challenge now for the future is that somehow the leaders of Europe have to get it clear in their own minds, but they have to be able to communicate to the public the difference there is between being influential and carrying your own weight and having really a place on the international scene that is commensurate to your achievements and to your true and objective worth and contribution, at the same time respecting, and not just as a sort of empty verbiage, but in true, real life facts and realities, the uniqueness of every cultural heritage. And not just that of nation states, which are so varied and so diverse even in their constitution, but even down to the regional level, down to the municipal level if so need be. Bremen, for instance, is a land like the Länder that are much larger like Bavaria. Bremen as a city has an identity of its own. They wanted to preserve it. It's costing them economically, but so be it. They chose that path. So you see, what we saw, for instance, at the Copenhagen conference on climate change a few years ago was a sad spectacle of the Europeans having got up this terrific program of protecting our planet, of programs for how to deal with global warming, of concrete steps and aims to be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And what happened? The Chinese walked all over them. The Chinese, as a matter of fact, walked all over Barack Obama, for that matter. No, seriously, at one point the Chinese had called together a meeting of a number of countries, and Barack Obama walks in and says, well, I'd like to participate. And the Chinese chairman says, sorry, we don't have a chair here in this room. They had to carry in a chair for Barack Obama so he could participate. So the Europeans were not the only ones that somebody else walked all over. The so-called BRICS now in the world are flexing their muscles. When you think of China with its 1.3 billion inhabitants, India with close to that, Brazil, which has not only had a huge population but has really carried through fantastic reforms since I first visited that country in the early 80s. It's made terrific progress by investing in science, in education, in innovation, and in cleaning up the corruption that, mind you, is still a serious problem in that country. So it can be done. But Europe, if it wants to keep its place in the world, has to get its act together in a global solidarity of countries that have respect for each other, that consider each other as equals, where the big ones don't look down on the little ones or the middle ones, but where they understand that working together you can create something that is bigger than the sum of all the parts. And that sum of all the parts, with this added value of collaboration and possibility. And this 500 million population, which can consider at least some of them as Europeans as well as being Spaniards or Catalans or Basques or Latvians or Lithuanians or Dutch or Belgians or what do you call it, Flamand? How do you say it in English? and Walloons and so on. One identity is like those Russian dolls that are one inside another, like the Matryoshka dolls. You can have multiple identities. All of you have multiple identities. So that when we have extremist populists saying in Europe, we have to get back to our roots, we have to exclude foreigners, we have to look to our own navels, we have to protect our walls and our bastions, they are wrong. Because the strength of Europe will come from looking beyond the borders like Schuman did. The strength of Europe will come from working together to common purpose, but allowing the things that subsidiarity delegates to other lower levels, letting them be. So that Brussels does not sweat the small stuff. Brussels should not be telling whether cucumbers be straight or crooked. It should not tell the Finns that they will get subsidies for fields that have been sown by the 1st of May, because that's how it was done when France and Italy established the norms. The Finns had to take, when they were joining the European Union, they had to take the Brussels bureaucrats to Finland and show them 1 meter of snow on the ground on the 1st of May and say, what would you like to plant in that, please? So Europe should not be sweating the small stuff, even though of course it needs rules about establishing agricultural subsidies and heaven knows what. By the way, speaking of agricultural subsidies, a sore point in Latvia. Our farmer, 7 years after joining the Union, with a northern climate, you are here in the 47th parallel north, we're in the 57th parallel north. Short summers, harsh climate, soil not very rich. And we have farmers' subsidies that are 5 to 6 times smaller than those of sunny Spain and Greece. Now, is that solidarity? Is that equitable? Is that equalizing the inequalities on both sides of the former Iron Curtain? I think not. So that there's a lot to be done. I'm not saying that things look perfect or rosy or without wrinkles on that collective face of Europe. But there's a job to be done. And it's a job that can be done by solidarily working together and ironing out the wrinkles as we go along, of which there are a great many, but step by step and brick by brick, one can work on that project as well. I am not sure what will happen about Europe. As a scientist, I know that the odds are 50-50 of success or failure of anything whatsoever if you leave it random. Random events, as you know, have a 50-50 chance of being one or the other. If everything else is random, then Europe has a 50-50 chance of continuing to grow, to improve its human rights and social equality, and make everybody rich and beautiful and happy and live a long life and fulfill all their dreams. Or it can grow into increasing irrelevance. It can become old hat and old history. And Brazil and Russia and India and China will take over because they have the resources of gas and oil or whatever else that the world will be needing at the time. Or they will have, if nothing else, huge population resources and they will be competitive. Or they will be more innovative than Europe. Working with the Commission on the European Research Council, I see that Europe, on common research funds, is spending far too little. I know my country is spending far too little and it's getting into a vicious circle of cutting its budget and saving money on education, and thank goodness there are universities like Maastricht where our students can come and get a good education. It was getting increasingly difficult. But Europe has to invest in education. All of Europe, all parts of it, not just Maastricht or Cambridge and Oxford. All of us have to invest. You liked that, didn't you? Nothing like a bit of flattery will go a long way. But we do have to do it. And you young people who are here getting your education, and I understand getting it under conditions where you are getting a sort of hands-on experience of real life, I think you are the ones who will change the odds. Your generation is the ones, not mine. We're sort of slowly fading away like old soldiers. Your generation will be the one to build up the odds in the favor of Europe. And everything that you, as an individual with your talent and your innovative skills and your success will do for your city, for your region, for your country, or for the continent, will be one more step, one more brick, something more in that common edifice that we're all building. Every single person who is negative, who destroys, who's antisocial, is a hindrance in that path. They make life more difficult for others. And of course, life is never very simple. Whether in democracy or in totalitarianism, people somehow survive, most of them, and they muddle on. The thing is, do we muddle on really without knowing where we're going? Or do we have a clear vision? Do we have an ideal? Do we have a clear path? My own vision is that Europe that Schuman envisaged so many years ago, is a great idea. I think it's a terrific idea. I think it has fantastic potential and it has already shown what it can achieve. But it's work in progress. I don't think it's finished. I think there's a hell of a lot still to be done. And ladies and gentlemen, I invite you all, roll up your sleeves and go to it.